Good day. Those of you who have wondered when it's going to warm up and dry up, hope you're happy. It warmed up and dried up, and I think we're supposed to have more of the same this week. I was thinking about yesterday, and if you were not here, you missed a wonderful experience on so many levels. Of course, we had our lift program, and we're able to help some folks, and we are happy with that we can reach out into our community. And as a matter of fact, some of our young people were very, very happy this morning that we had a lady with us who we had contacted through the lift program yesterday, and that's just an encouraging thing for us. And then we had people who were helping get the outside fixed up for our meeting with John DeBerry. And a lot of our kids, we worked them hard yesterday. They picked up rocks and put in the white gravel, at least in that part of the building, the front. And I appreciate that, kids. I really do. And Mr. Al was giving rides on his tractor, and the kids loved that. And I think maybe some of the adults wanted to get on there and ride with him. So that was just a real rich experience. And I had the opportunity to talk to a lady who attends here and about her soul. And I had a wonderful discussion about that. And I think she is contemplating being baptized for the remission of sins. She said she had done that a long time ago, but it was not for remission of sins, and it wasn't for her, it was for other people who were doing that. And so she has come to the conclusion she needs to do something for herself, and so we are looking forward to that happening. So it just was a great, great day, and it illustrates the wonderful attitude that is in this congregation. I know that some of you were tired. Kenny said his dragon was wagon, his wagon was dragging. Is that what it was? Yeah. I never heard that, so I couldn't remember it enough to say it. And I do know that Barbara and some of her children stayed and cleaned the building after everything else was done. I don't know how you get everything done, Barbara. You are superwoman. I'm convinced that you are superwoman. And so we just appreciate everybody being involved. We had a great service this morning, I thought. Had a good crowd, and people were very encouraged and encouraging. And that's good for me. And we've got children, young people leaving on mission trips. Tristan and Bella are getting ready to go. And then our oldest children back there, Heather, is getting ready to go. And that's just a wonderful experience. This little congregation, let me tell you what. We have people, and they want to work, and they want to be involved, and I thank you for that so very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. We are at lesson number 17 in our series from the book of Ephesians. We are at chapter 6. And we're going to be talking about the relationship of parents and children tonight. We talked about the relationship of husbands and wives at the end of chapter 5, verses 22 through the end of the chapter. And now we're ready to deal with the relationship of parents and children. I believe the relationship of parents and children is the second the closest, most important relationship there is. Human relationship. I'm going to say that our greatest relationship ought to be with God. But I believe our relationship as parents and children is second only to our relationship as husbands and wives. Now, I think sometimes we get those two backwards. And there are people who say, I just live for my children. Well, I get that. I understand what you're saying. But your children will grow up and in all likelihood leave. But you're going to have your mate. And you need to make sure that that relationship is what it ought to be. And you get that one right, you'll come closer to having the right kind of relationship with your children. The parent-child relationship is one that can bring you a lot of joy and happiness. It can also bring you a lot of sorrow and grief. And there are people who can testify to both sides of that. I've had people tell me I am so sad because of the relationship with my children. And others say it is a joy, the relationship I have with my children. So it can bring you joy, it can bring you sorrow. If we're going to understand what Ephesians 6 says, we have to believe, have to understand that the Bible was written in a time frame. Now, although there is application here to people way down here on planet Earth in 2024, it was not written directly to us. It was written to people who were living in the first century. Therefore, some of the things that Paul will say must be viewed against that background. Do you know that the relationship of Romans and their children was not good at all? And as a matter of fact, the father of the family was absolutely in control of children, even to the point that he could sell them into slavery if he wanted to. Now, I know that there are children today who, when they're asked to clean their room, think they're certainly in slavery. But that has nothing to do with the slavery of the first century as far as Romans were concerned. And furthermore, they were merciless when it came to children that had some kind of problem, either sickness or were crippled in some way. They wanted nothing to do with them. They wanted perfect children who were well and well developed. And so we have to understand something of what he says in this passage against the backdrop of the situation at the time. Now, we can take it and apply it today and learn from it, but it was written against that backdrop. I wonder today if we've gone to the opposite extreme of what the Bible says. Let me read some verses to you in chapter 6 of Ephesians. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. I'm afraid that we have gone to the extreme of where children's rights are more important than parents' rights. I want the rights of both to be respected. But it seems today that we have children who are undisciplined, who have no responsibilities, who are given everything as if giving stuff earns their love and somehow makes a good relationship, and it doesn't. But clearly in Ephesians 6, Paul established the order of things. And children should not run the house. I remember asking some parents if they were going to do something, and their question or their answer was, we have to check with, and they called their son's name and see if it's okay with him. Really? Seriously? God never intended for children to be in charge of the home and to make the decisions. Now, whatever decision is made should be made with them in mind, certainly. And their input can be valuable. But folks, it's parents over children, not the other way around. And I believe that Paul must have thought that children would read this epistle. And I'll tell you why I think that. He started out by saying, children. He addressed children. So evidently he thought that children were going to read this or maybe have it read to them. So, children, I want you to listen to me tonight. The first part of this sermon is to you, children. First of all, he says, obey your parents. Now, for those of you who have studied 1 John with me and some other books, you know that we've talked a lot about present tense verbs. And you know that a present tense verb means continuous action. The verb obey is present tense. You know what that means? Children, keep on obeying your parents. Now, the parameters of that obedience is in the Lord. Which means if your parents ask you to do something that is contrary to the teachings of God, you certainly don't have to do that, shouldn't do that. I know parents who have trained their children and demanded that they shoplift, for instance. And we'll get the attention of the clerks, and you run in there and pick some stuff up. Now, that's contrary to the teachings of God, and parents shouldn't certainly teach their children to do anything like that. So the parameter is, inasmuch as it is consistent with the Word of God. Acts 5:29, when Peter and the others were told to quit preaching, and they didn't, their explanation was, we ought to obey God rather than man. And I believe that this accountability is there as long as the child is a part of that family unit. Now, I know as children grow up, as they get into their teenage years, that certainly they should be given more rights, more responsibilities, more liberty, more freedom. But I kind of feel if you are a child and still at home, that this passage applies to you, children. A modern version of this, I think, is parents obey your children, for this will make it a whole lot easier at home and a lot happier at home. I know parents have told me, we give in to our children because if we don't, it'll be miserable. They'll cry and pout and throw things, and let them cry and pout and throw things. And then discipline them for crying and pouting and throwing things. Again, I say, it's children obey your parents in the Lord. It's not parents obey your children, whatever they want. And he says, secondly, honor your parents. I think that's crucial because you can obey technically without honoring, because honoring is a matter of the heart that expresses itself in an outward way. Honoring is the attitude that produces the right kind of action. You might say, do this, and they say, I'll do this, and they mumble under their breath all the way and have not nice things to say about you for what you've asked of them. So there is a difference technically between honoring and obeying. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 16, and I think this is, there's some interesting things said in Deuteronomy. We'll get to chapter 6 in just a little bit. But Deuteronomy 5:16 is the giving of the Ten Commandments. And verse 16 is very clear on what one of those is: honor your father and mother. as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be long, and that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Now, I don't intend for you to believe that if you don't honor your parents, they're going to kill you. But I do suggest that you'll probably live a longer, happier life if you develop the right kind of attitude toward your parents. Honor them. Now, what would that look like? What would that include? I think it would include thoughtfulness. Just being thoughtful. Just saying things like, I really appreciate you, Dad, or I appreciate you, Mom. And I thank you for the things that you do for me, for the sacrifices that you make so that I can have the things I have. Do you realize that I would expect that parents do without things so children can have things? And they make a lot of sacrifices. I mentioned on one of my Boost programs recently how much I miss my mother. She passed away in 1986. I'll have to tell you that when I did the first cut of that podcast, I said she'd passed away in 1886. And I thought, I probably need to go back and redo that. But she was a wonderful woman. And she gave up much for me, I'll tell you. We weren't allowed, we didn't have the money to go out and eat at restaurants. We just didn't do that. And I have a sister that is a birth sister. I have a brother and a sister who were foster brothers and sisters. And my mother raised her sister, who's younger than I am, who was my aunt. So there were actually 5 children of my parents on a preacher's pay when preachers weren't paid very much. And I can remember us having chicken, and you got one piece of chicken. And all of a sudden she would decide that she liked the neck and the back best. Now I will tell you, there's not a whole lot of meat on a chicken neck and a chicken back. But she did that so that her children and her husband could have better. I remember when she sold some things that were very precious to her so that I could go with my band that I was playing in to Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City. And it cost $40. We didn't have $40. I didn't have $40. And she sold some things that were precious to her so I could have the $40 and a little bit of spending money. That's not unusual for parents to do that. Honor them. Let them know you appreciate things like that. Tell them you'll love them without wanting something as a result of it. Mean it. I love you. Talk to them and about them respectfully. That means you use proper terminology. If I had called my mother the old lady, I would not be here today sitting on this stool by any stretch of the imagination. If I were, I would be in terrible shape. That just not tolerated. Never thought about that. Never thought about saying things that were disrespectful to them. If I wanted to say them, I'd better mumble them under my breath so that they were not heard, or I was in a great deal of difficulty. And bear some of the duties around the house. Mama's not your maid, okay? You may be asked to make your bed. You may be asked to clean your room. Honor your parents, children. Paul said that, and I believe he's right. And I believe this attitude should continue even when we grow older. In the book of John, chapter 19, Jesus is on the cross. You know who he thought about in verse 26? His mama. And he said to John, the disciple whom he loved, Son, behold your mother. Mother, behold your son. Jesus knew that he couldn't care for her. Obviously, Joseph was dead, and he wanted to make sure that his mother was taken care of. And Sierra and I both have thought that we were responsible for caring for our parents. We had her mother for a good while and my dad for a good while, and took care of them because we thought that was our responsibility. And it was not only something we should do, but something we should want to do and appreciate doing for what they did for us over the years. And as a matter of 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, it says, if a man will not provide for his own, he's worse than an unbeliever. That means if your parents are alive and they may not live close to you, or they may live close to you, maintain a relationship with them. That means you can minister to them and take care of them as you are able to do. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And then he turns to fathers. And you fathers. Now the word that is used here for fathers in some translations, not very many, but in some is translated parents. And I would think that both parents have a responsibility to children. And I'm sad that there are families where both parents are not present. And therefore the duty falls upon the parent who is there. And there are some situations where the father has all of that responsibility. There are situations where the mother has all of that responsibility. It's God's desire that there be a mother and father in each family. I understand that's his will. That isn't always the case. But he says, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Now, does that mean you can never upset your children? No. I have upset mine on more than one occasion. And so he's not saying don't ever do anything that makes your child hacked off at you. Colossians 3:21 is a parallel passage. He says, don't discourage them. And what that means is that we might, as fathers, treat our children in a way that does exasperate them, that does discourage them. Let me give you some examples. What about unreasonable requirements? Now, I suspect from what I'm going to say next that there's somebody going to say, well, when I was growing up, that's what my mother and dad did. I wasn't there. I wasn't preaching when your mother and dad were there, but I'm going to preach to you. I think that parents can make unreasonable commands and requirements of children. How about this one? You will sit there until you eat every bite on your plate. I don't care what happens. If you like it or don't like it, if you throw up, I don't care. You're going to sit there and eat it. Now, in my judgment, that's unreasonable. Do you always clean up your plate and eat every bite on it? Well, you may. Bless your heart. I try to, because I was one of those who was taught that I needed to clean up my plate. But could it be that sometimes we make requirements just because we can and just to prove a point, rather than because they make sense? I've got a daughter sitting back there that the only thing green that she likes is money. If it's green, she doesn't want to eat it. And she could sit down to a plate of green beans, and I would be happy doing that, especially if they're fresh, half runners from the garden. I would just be thrilled to death with that. She's not going to eat them. I could have required her to growing up. She would still be sitting there, and they would have mold all over them by now, I'm sure. Don't make unreasonable requests just because you have the power to make the request. And make sure that you don't give undue punishment. Now, as we say, the punishment should fit the crime. But sometimes we punish a child not for their benefit, but for ours. We take out our frustration and our anger on a child. And I've done that. I proved that I could do it. But when I got through, I wasn't fair. And I have to say that I have apologized to my children for doing that. If it is a small thing, punish them accordingly. If it's a big thing, punish them accordingly. But sometimes we let all of that build up, and then we just go off the deep end. And we just yell and scream and throw things. Folks, you never get anything done by yelling at your children. All you do is teach them to be yellers. It doesn't solve. You can make your same point calmly, and it carries the weight. I will confess to you, that I learned how far to push my mother, especially. There was no pushing with my dad. He was rather hard-nosed about the whole deal. But I learned, if she said, Tommy, I still had room. If she said Thomas Clyde, I was getting close. And if she said Thomas Clyde Miller, I had stepped over the line, and I was in deep trouble at that point. But I learned. Children learn how far to push you. And some of us think that they can push us until we scream and threaten. That doesn't get stuff done, folks. Doesn't. Don't do it. Please, don't do it. Inconsistency provokes children. One day they can be punished for this, and the next day they're not. Like they don't know what to do. Is it a bad thing or a good thing? Do I get in trouble or do I not get in trouble? There has to be consistency and discipline. Favoritism. Now you're going to tell me I loved all my children the same. Well, of course you did. Or do. Did you have one that maybe just a little more favorite? It's all right to confess. It can be a problem. There's a story about Jacob and Esau. Do you remember that? That Jacob was the favorite son of his mother and Esau was the favorite son of his father, and boy, that didn't work out well at all. Fathers tend to make their little girls their favorite and treat them differently than they do their little boys. And mothers tend to make their sons their favorites and treat them a little different than they do their daughters. That's not across the board always, but it is a tendency for the opposite sex. Please be consistent. Don't play favorites. Don't let one get away with something that the other can't get away with. Don't neglect. And I feel guilty right here. You want to know who is the worst at neglecting children, or at least among the worst? Preachers. You know why? Preachers are off saving the world. And they don't spend the time sometimes with their children. There are fathers today, especially fathers, who neglect their children. And then wonder, when they grow a little bit older, well, I don't know what happened. I know what happened. You didn't have time for them. I've told you the story of being out in the front yard when my son was in, I don't know, 4th, 5th grade, something like that. And we were passing a Nerf football back and forth and having a great time. And one of the elders of the church pulled up in a car right on front and caught us. And I felt terrible. Now you're saying you shouldn't have. It doesn't matter. I did, because I was an elder. I should have been off having a Bible study with somebody. I should have been in my study preparing my sermon. In the front yard, tossing a Nerf football with my son. I tell you what, if I had it to do all over again, I'd toss the football with him more often. I have often commented on all of the stuff I was in high school. I loved high school, okay? I mean, I was in everything coming and going. I was in the thespians. Can you imagine me being in plays and doing things like that? I mean, I know that's just beyond your ability to imagine, but I was in everything that went on. The Mu Alpha Theta, look that up in your Funkin' Wagnall to find out what that's about. It's a math club. I was in the band. I was in all kinds of stuff. Loved it. You know who never showed up at anything I was in? My dad. He was too busy. Broke my heart. And before he died, he apologized to me. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. He also says positively, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Fathers, well, you know, mom does that. Fathers, well, she's better at it than I am. Fathers, well, I've got to go fishing and hunting and golfing and, you know, all the stuff that men do, man stuff. Bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. I think this says that spiritual training ought to begin at home. The joke was, and it wasn't much of a joke, that parents send their children off to a Christian college so the Christian college could kind of rehabilitate them for what they couldn't get done at home. And I'll tell you what, college I went to had some Lulus in it. It was a little hard to imagine if they came from a Christian home, but fathers did not bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Father, set the example. Talk to your children about the Lord. Make sure that they see you at church services. Pray with them. Study the Bible with them. Well, mom can help. And sometimes when the father is not there, the mother has to do it by herself. As a matter of fact, that was the case with Timothy. His mother was a Jewess. His father was a Greek. His father wasn't going to tell him about Jesus, but his mother did, and his grandmother, Eunice and Lois. And Paul said that from a child you've known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise to salvation. Let me read something from Deuteronomy 6. I told you that Deuteronomy was a great book about this. Let me pick up the reading at verse 3. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And these words which I command you today shall be in your hearts, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. He said, parents, train your children. Talk to them. Teach them. Set the right example before them. Well, here's a final word. I don't know any perfect children. I don't know any perfect parents. I don't want you to think, boy, he's been pretty tough on us tonight. Children may be thinking that. Parents may be thinking that. And so he thinks he's all that. No. Not by any stretch. I blew it on a number of things. Wish we could get a do-over. I can't. I don't know any perfect parents. Don't know any perfect children. But here's what I know. So much depends upon parents wanting their children, loving their children, and training their children. I would think one of the greatest disappointments in the world is having children who don't know the Lord, and you feel guilty about it. A lot of other things can enter into that. I'm not saying that parents are wholly to blame, but I'm saying it is a heavy burden to bear. I believe we must carefully study the Word for instructions and principles that help us have stable, happy homes. Children, did you hear me tonight? Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Can you imagine how wonderful it would be to be in a home like that? Can you imagine?